Okay. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Alhamdulillahi Rabbil Alameen. Wa salatu Allahi wa salamuhu ala nabiyhi al-Kareem wa ala alihi wa ashabihi ajma'een. Okay, we're going to continue on the topic of zakah. This is probably like I think this is like our sixth session on zakah. Again, zakah tends to be one of those, it's a topic that just requires a lot of detail. And even in this, in our book, al-Muhadhdhab, right, which means again the trimming down or the pruning, literally like pruning, right? We're getting a much reduced version of the fiqh of zakah, and so you can see even in the introduction to it, requires quite a bit. So in this session, inshallah, today we're going to be talking about zakatul dain, or the zakah of debt, or at least a cursory view of debt. What is it, and how does it function in our calculation of zakah? And so the author al-Musannaf hafidhahullah begins, right? He says ad-dain darban. So ad-dain darban. Debt can be considered of two types. Dain يتقدم لصاحبه قبض أصله. So a debt for which the principal has not yet been taken ownership or received by the owner, كمهر المرأة, like giving the dowry to a woman for marriage, وبدل الخلع, or compensation for a khula, or one of the forms of divorce in Islam, وأجرة المنافع, payment for services. He says فلا تجب فيه الزكاة حتى يقبضه. That zakah is not then obligatory or calculated for those until they've been taken possession for, وَيَمْضِي عَلَيْهِ تَمَامْ حَوْ, and that there has to be held for a full lunar year. فِي يَدِهِ, right? I mean, you have to take possession of it. Dain تَقَدَّمْ مِلْقُ أَصْلِهِ. So the other type of debt is debt for which the principal has already been received. Right, so dain taqaddam milku aslihi kabadl al-qard wa thamn al-bay', such as the repayment of a loan or the price of something that was sold, the price of a sale. وهذا لا يزكيه صاحبه حتى يقبض منه نصابا. And so the individual does not pay zakah until they have received an amount that pushes them over the nisab, that they go above the calculation amount for nisab. ففيه الزكاة لسنة واحدة ولو أقام عند المدين 10 سنين. So zakah is then due on it for 1 year, even if it remains with the debtor for 10 years. He said, however, إِلَّا فِي دَيْنِ التَّاجِرِ الْمُدِيرِ, except in the case of a merchant or a business person who actively trades. التاجر المدير. فحكمه حكم العروض كما سبق. And therefore the ruling on that is the same as that which was mentioned before on trade goods, and you can look that up in the last lesson. اعلم أن الدين اسم لكل ما يثبت في الذمة من الحقوق المالية. So what is debt? How do we define it? It is a term for any financial obligation that establishes liability. سواء كان من الأموال النقدية أو عينية, whether that be in the form of cash or other tangible goods, or even من المنافع, even in benefits or services. كمن استأجر أجيرا للقيام بعمل معين. And so, for example, if you hire a worker to perform some specific tasks, and then فإن ذلك العمل داين في ذمته حتى ينجزه. That task becomes a kind of debt in their liability until it's completed. All right, so he's just giving some explanation. وهذا المعنى العام للدين. Now this is the general meaning of dine. وهو الذي جاء به الحديث. And this is, now how do we come by that? This is the definition and the type of debt as we find in the hadith where the Prophet ﷺ says, "What يغفر للشهيد كل ذنب إلا الدين," in which he ﷺ said, a martyr can be forgiven for any sin that they commit except for dying. Now it's interesting that therefore in this hadith the Prophet ﷺ is mentioning dhanb, sins, and then mentions dying, and they both can be what? Forgiven. So it's not to say that to be in debt is sinful. No. But debt, like sins, create liabilities. So it's also a beautiful way for us to think about when I commit a sin. Right? And this is why the study of fiqh is so important, because it teaches us how to look at so many other aspects of our deen in its entirety, right? So when I commit a sin, I am indebted to Allah. I'm indebted to Him, and debt requires, right? It's like if you get if you have a credit card, forget about the riba for a moment. Let's just say, you have a line of credit that is not riba based. You have a line of credit. You take out a $2,000 line of credit. I have an obligation to my creditor. I have an obligation to the one that gave me this qard, this loan, to pay it back. And so if I took out that loan, and I have to know what the terms are of the loan, right? But let's say I took out the loan and the terms were 2 years. I have to pay it back in 2 years. Well, I can't then in that 2 years say, I'm not really worried about it. I'll deal with it later. No, I have to take that obligation very seriously and pay it back in the time that it is due, because now I'm now indebted to that person. In the same way, when we commit sins, we are indebted to Allah, and we don't know how much time we have. Right? That's the difference. Okay, if I take out a loan from, if Dawood loans me $20 and I have 2 weeks to pay it back, okay, I know the terms. But when I commit a sin against Allah, then I don't know what the time I have. And so I have to rush back to Allah Ta'ala and ask for forgiveness. So this also, just aside from explaining zakah, it gives us a window, an important window into our Islam. So he said, sallallahu alaihi wasallam, يغفر للشهيد كل ذنب إلا الدين. أخرجه مسلم عن عبد الله ibn Amr وابن العاص. And this is something you can find recorded in Imam Muslim's Sahih, according to these two Sahabi. قال النووي, likewise النووي, he mentions إلا الدين ففيه تنبيه على جميع حقوق الآدميين. Imam Nawawi, in his commentary, of which we had read before, he has something to say about the Prophet's statement, sallallahu alaihi wasallam, إلا الدين, except for debt obligation, indicating what? He said it is ففيه تنبيه على جميع حقوق الآدميين. It indicates the significance of all rights related to the sons and daughters of Adam. Meaning, like, take your obligations to other people very seriously and don't infringe upon their rights. So the important thing to understand about zakah and I think we had mentioned this in the very beginning when we got to this bab, to this chapter, is that what is zakah? So we define zakah lughawiyan, we defined it linguistically, it is what? It is tazkiyah, tahara, it is purification, but it is also takbir, it is also growth. But it is also a haqq lil masakin. It is for lil masakin. It is a right that the poor have. So when you have reached your nisab, you are holding on as if the masakin, as if the poor are actually your creditor and you are their debtor. You owe it. I mean, ultimately, right, we owe this haqq, this hukum to Allah. But I owe these people owe. And this is why in fiqh, to pay zakah is to pay it first in the area in which that zakah is earned, the money is earned. So where you accumulate your wealth in the nisab, the fuqara and the masakin in that area, they have a right first to it. So that's also just another important way for us to be able to conceive وما هي الزكاة, like what is zakah. المقصود به في هذا الفصل الأموال النقدية والعينية دون غيرها. So the intended meaning in this particular section that al-Majjājī talks about refers to cash and other tangible assets to the exclusion of other types. وَالدَّيْنُ قَدْ يَكُونْ لَكَ أَوْ عَلَيْكَ. And debt can either be owed to you or owed by you. You know, I took out a loan, or it can be owed to you. Right? If I loan Dawood $50, I cannot calculate my zakah, or I cannot include that $50 that I loaned to him in my zakah until I get it back, and then I hold it for what? A calendar year, a lunar year. فإن كان عليك فقد سبق قريبا أنه يسقط الزكاة عنك في المال الصامت الباطن دون الظاهر. So if it was mentioned earlier that it exempts you from paying zakah on hidden internal wealth, meaning again wealth that you don't have full possession of, but not on visible wealth, meaning that wealth that you have possession of. If its amount or value reduces wealth below the nisab, and you do not have other forms of value, then to cover your debt, then you don't pay. So we said before, you know, this is why people can be leveraged in a certain way. You can say, okay, I have $10,000 of assets, and the amount that I would reach to pay my zakah, the nisab, let's say it's $3,000. But if I've loaned out $8,000 of that, or I loaned out $4,000 of it, and then also I took out a loan for another $4,000, I don't really own those assets because they're leveraged beyond my possession, and I don't determine that until they come back for a lunar year. وبالنسبة إلى قولي في يده, right? So regarding the phrase like being in your possession, لعموم حديث, it comes also based on the general understanding of the hadith. ليس في مال زكاة حتى يحول عليه الحول. So there is no zakah. Zakah is not determined or not calculated until a full year has passed over. رواه من الصحابة علي وابن عمر وأنس وعائشة رضي الله عنهم أجمعين. And this was narrated from the companions like Ali and Ibn Umar and Anas and the wife of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, Aisha, may Allah be pleased with them all. He says, وَفِي أَسَانِدِهَا, as it relates to the chains of narration of this hadith, كُلُّهَا كَلَام. Right? All of these are considered sound statements. وَأَجْوَدُهَا حَدِيث عَلِي. The strongest of those narrations is the one from Ali ibn Abi Talib رضي الله عنه. أخرجه أبو داود في سننه مطولا. And so, in this particular hadith, you will find in the collection of Imam Abi Dawood, which is called his Sunan or the Sunnah Abu Dawood, and it's related in the entirety. وحسنه الزيلعي, and so al-Zayla'i, one of the ulama of hadith, he says that he relates this as Hasan. I mean, it's sound, it's good, it's not sahih, right? But he considers it a sound relation. في نصب الراية, in his work on that, the نصب الراية. ونقل عن النووي قوله في خلاصة, and likewise he also quotes Imam Nawawi's statement therein in his book called al-Khulasa, in which he says, وَهُوَ hadith sahih, which Imam Nawawi says what? It is actually a sahih hadith, أو hasan, or perhaps graded to hasan, but either way acceptable. وقال العراقي في تخريج أحاديث الإحياء, and then al-Iraqi, who does like a kind of rendering of the ahadith in the Ihya, he says isnaduhu jayyid, its chain is good. وإنما لم ينظر في اعتبار الحول إلى يوم الملك. The consideration for the year for determining zakah is not based on the day of ownership, بل إلى يوم القبض. So not the day you take ownership of it. So let's say if you're going to pay zakah on I don't know, some gold bullion, right? Not gold that you're going to wear for jewelry, because there's no zakah on that, but gold bullion. The day that you take possession of it, that's not when you calculate, but rather you have to be able to hold it, or just cash. Let's say you sold something. I made a $10,000 profit, right? You got to be able to hold that for a year before you hold it. So the technical terms in Arabic is qabd. That's why in Salah, when you put your hands up like this is called qabd. And the hands at the side, which according to some of the Malikiyah and others, putting the hands at the side is sadal. But I'm just saying some of you may be familiar with those terms. So in the istirahat of zakah, in the technical terminology, we're called qabd. When you take the initial hold of it, biyadik, we call this milk. Milk, like milk, right? Milk that is related to what? Mim, lam, kaf, to own something, like al-Malik or mulk, walillahi mulku samawati wal ard. Likewise, with a kasra on the mim, milk. This means the initial ownership, but not the holding. لأن الاستقراء دل على أن الزكاة في مال معللة بوجود النماء فيه. He said that possession is what is over that lunar year is what is important, because investigation has shown that zakah and wealth is contingent upon its potential for growth. So let's say you sell something, you make a $10,000 profit. Well, particularly if you are the tajir madir, if you are like a person that is a active business person buying and trading, you may take that 10 grand and invest it, and it might produce 20 grand for you in profit, or 13, or whatever. It may grow, or buy other assets with it, right? So in order to really be able to give it its right, its haqq, we have to see what the growth potential is for it. وَالدَّائِن مَال غَيْرُ نَامٍ. And so debt is considered non-growing wealth, right? It's considered wealth, but it's considered what? Mal غَيْرُ نَام, wealth, but non-growing wealth. لأن صاحبه, because its owner مقطوع عنه, because its owner is unable to access it. In some way you're cut off from it. And he says that it is what غير متمكن من الانقفاع به والاستمائه. so that the owner is both cut off from it and unable to benefit from it or to increase it. كالمال المغصوب والمسروق والضائع. Similar to wealth that has been seized or stolen or lost. Right? It's your wealth, but it doesn't bring you any benefit, and you can't leverage it in any positive way. وبالنسبة إلى قول حتى يقبض منه نصابا. And so now in the statement as it relates to not until it is held and possessed until the equivalent, the nisab amount is reached. He said, وكذلك إذا كمل نصابا مع ما بيده من المال النقدي الذي تجب فيه الزكاة. Similarly, if the nisab is completed when combined with the cash that that person possesses, that is also subject to zakah, provided that they share the same zakah year. Right? So they have to be, this all has to occur within the same year. إذا كان يجمعهما حول واحد. They have to be in the same year. ومثاله أن يكون النصاب في تلك السنة. So he gives an example. He said, take for example, an example of this is if the nisab for that year is 70,000 dinar. That is, let's say the nisab for that year is 70,000 dinars. And he has 40,000 dinars, which a full year has passed upon. And he receives a payment of 30,000 dinars from a debt that has been due for a year or more. So what happens? In this case, zakah is obligatory on the total amount since the nisab has been met with the conditions that we just mentioned. They were combined, happens within the same year, then you can. But if they did not occur in the same year, then no. ثم متى قبض دفعة أخرى, then whenever he receives another installment of that debt, من ذلك الدين أدى زكاة عند قبضها. Then what happens is he pays zakah at the time of receiving it versus having to then possess it again for a whole other year, right? قليلا كانت أو كثيرة, whether that is a little amount or a big amount. لأنها تابعة للدفعة الأولى, as it follows the ruling of the first installment. كالحكم في مدع الذهب والفضة. And this is similar to the ruling on gold and silver in terms of mining, right? Meaning if you find some more, immediately it's due. وأما الدين الذي لا يتعلق الزكاة بأصله كثمن أرض أو دار باعها أو أثاب منزلي أو نحو ذلك فلا زكاة عليه في حتى يقبضه وتمضي السنة عليه في يده. And so as for debt on which zakah is not applicable to its principal, such as the price of land or a house that the person sold or household furniture or some other things that normally zakah is not due upon, there's no zakah on it until he receives it and a full year passes on it in his possession, like a debt for which the owner did not previously possess in principle. So that is the section on the basics of zakah, of how debt works and affects debt calculation. So in the PDF I'll upload to the website, I have 2 ending slides that just go over a summary of the key points as it relates to the zakah of debt. And then I have a short term here at the back about some of the mustalahat or the technical terms with English and the transliteration. And so we will continue next week with our part on zakah. Again, we have several more parts to go here because zakah is very, very detailed and requires a lot of explanation. And I like to do it in smaller bits because otherwise you kind of drown in the information. So we do a little bit every week, inshallah. Unless there's any questions, inshallah, we'll wrap up. Oh, one question, yes.
Why would the debt or gold or something immediately year by someone else?
No, so the part that he talks here about the debt, if it so let's say you're talking about the situation of which it could potentially be due immediately. So he said, for instance, if your nisab for that year, you would have to earn 70,000 dinars or 70 grand, whatever. Don't worry about the currency, like 70 grand, right? And you currently have 40 grand in your possession that you've held for an entire year. But then maybe you lent out some money that comes back to you in the total of 30 grand. So then that bumps you up to that 70 grand mark. In this case, you have an obligation to pay zakah on that. But then, let's say you had loaned out though, let's say the total of that loan was say 50 grand. And so the person pays you one installment of 30, you combine that 30 with your 40, you've now met the nisab. But then 2 weeks later, a month later, he sends you another $1,000, even though that's a small amount compared to the overall amount of the loan. Then as you receive that, because you've already passed the nisab, then you would calculate the 2.5% on that $1,000. And so for every subsequent payment that comes in towards that 50 grand that you lent that person, because you've already passed the nisab at 70, every installment that comes in, you would pay zakah on the installments, where normally you would not do that until you meet the nisab. So let's say the same scenario, you loaned out 50 grand. You have 40 in your possession, and the initial payment is 20. Well, 30 and 20 is 50. 70 is the nisab, you haven't met it yet. So every time that person pays you some installment because you haven't reached the nisab, nothing happens. Only once you reach it, then it activates. And then every subsequent installment, big or small, over that, then you would pay the zakat.
But duration has no bearing on this situation now in regards to the year.
Well, you have to have the initial parts. Right.
Next thing, if, say, so usually we like to pay in Ramadan.
Sure. Yeah, a lot of people like to pay the zakah in Ramadan, yes.
So let's say I got 10 grand, I'm at my nisab. One note, I have it now, but I haven't held it for a year.
Right.
And Ramadan comes in. It wouldn't be zakah. Even if I would technically.
So if you pay it during Ramadan, let's say you pay it the 10th of Ramadan every year, that's your day, right? It has to be a full calendar year. So even if it's like the first day of Ramadan and you're at the nisab amount, but you have not completed that whole year, you don't pay it until the 10th. Because let's say on the 9th, something happens, your car gets hit by a bus, and all of a sudden you got to shell out that, and that depletes you on the 5th that happens, and you have to spend all of that 10 grand on fixing your car. Well, then you don't hold. That's why I said it wants to know about the growth potential or lack of growth potential of holding it over that year before you calculate it.
Now, let's say Ramadan passes, I'm still holding my 10 grand because I haven't got the duration of time yet, right?
Well, I'm saying if you've held it since the previous Ramadan.
Let's say I got it a month before Ramadan started. I have to wait a year before it really counts.
Yes, so you may want to pay your, right, so let's say in Sha'ban, you get like some payout of 10 grand, but you normally pay your zakah in Ramadan. Well, you pay your zakah in Ramadan on the money that you've held since last Ramadan, right? And so obviously if you got it in Sha'ban or Muharram, right, then you don't pay it yet because you have not held it. The qabd, you have not held it for that entire time.
We go a year, I got that 10 grand, I held it. Shaban comes, but I want to pay it in Ramadan. Is it a requirement that I can hold it a little longer? I have to pay it immediately when a year comes. Forget Ramadan, just any time. Once my year has reached, it's incumbent upon me.
I think the part we get confused on is like all these, like when you, the dates of possession and the dates of holding. You're going to take possession of money all throughout the year, all 12 months. You're getting paid, like let's say you have a job, you get paid every month, right? But you're only going to pay on what you have hold or have held for an entire year. So things are going to come and go. Money's going to go in and out, in and out, in and out, in and out. What you want to know is what money have I completely held? That's why you have to kind of keep track or have a ledger or something to be able to look back at your statements and say like, well, how much money have I truthfully held for a year?
Yeah, no, but okay, let me rephrase this. Am I sinful?
No, you're only sinful. Let's say you pay every year in Ramadan, but you took possession of that money in Sha'ban, the month before Ramadan. And then because you took possession of it in Sha'ban, Ramadan, the first Ramadan comes, you've only had it for a month, so you don't pay it. So then technically, right, you could still pay it the next Ramadan. It's not that you would be sinful because you've held it. You shouldn't go longer than, much longer than that, because ideally, you need to pay out your zakah, right? So you shouldn't, well, I'll pay it in Muharram and I'll wait. No, right? So yeah, you calculate on what you have held for those period of times, not, you do need to keep track of your possessions. I took possession on it this day, but did I hold it for an entire year? That's kind of the problem of fixating on, it's fine to pick a day, because you're not going to pay. Because the other thing that would be confusing is like, well, I took possession of that 10 grand in Sha'ban, and I took possession of this and that. So you're not going to pay zakah every month throughout the year. Well, I paid zakah in Sha'ban for what I held from Sha'ban to Sha'ban. Then I pay in Ramadan of what I held from Ramadan to Ramadan, and then I pay in Dhul Hijjah of what I paid from Dhul Hijjah. No, you don't do it like this, right? That's why there's a month that you know and what you hold in that time that you held for an entire year. So there might be some overlap, but as long as you, and so let's say like you took it in Sha'ban, normally you pay in Ramadan. And so a whole entire year passes, and so now you're like, oh man, I've held it for 11 months. It seems like, well, or 13 months. It seems like I'm cheating here. I've held it for a longer period of time. Even if by the 12th month, by Ramadan, right, let's say by the next Sha'ban, you don't have that money. If you held it all the way through Sha'ban, and by the time you get to Ramadan, you've already used that money for something else. Too bad, you held it for a year, you still have zakah due on it, right? So this is why I have to kind of keep track of your stuff, right? Yeah. So inshallah, we'll have session 7 next week, and anybody else that has any questions, they can drop them in the comments on YouTube. Inshallah, we'll see you next week. Jazakum Allahu khairan. Wa sallallahu wa sallam wa barak ala Sayyidina Muhammad wa ala alihi wa sahbihi ajma'in. Walhamdulillahi Rabbil Alameen.